Hello, ooh, loud. This paper is called I'm Going to Trust This Until It Burns Me, Parents' Privacy Concerns and Delegation to Trust in K-8 Educational Technology. My name is Victoria Zhong. I'm from NYU, and this is work I did with Professor Susan McGregor from Columbia and Rachel Greenstadt in NYU. So in 2020, COVID restrictions forced most schools to move to remote learning. Unsurprisingly, the rapid technology adoption this required helped make schools more of a target for cyber attacks. In fact, a Sophos white paper found that 44% of ransomware attacks in 2020 targeted the education sector, and more than half succeeded. While many of these targets were colleges and universities, K-8 schools were and continue to be targeted. In fact, earlier this summer, the MOVEit data breach exposed the sensitive personal information of an estimated 45,000 students. The largest incident involving K-12 was the Illuminate data breach in January 2022. Illuminate Education owns widely used EdTech platforms such as Pupil Path, Schedula, and IO Classroom. We actually learned about this one from our participants. This data breach affected at least 820,000 students in New York City alone, over 1 million in New York State, and millions nationwide. According to the New York City Department of Education, this breach exposed general PII, educational information including academic, testing information, whether a student was an English language learner, and whether the student was economically disadvantaged, and whether or not they received special education services, though it did not expose which services they received. Given that education is increasingly being subject to cyber attacks and that technology will continue to be used in classrooms, in fact, New York City schools will replace snow days, days where schools are closed due to inclement weather, with remote learning days. We want to understand what security and privacy concerns parents who facilitate their children's technology usage had with regards to technology that their children use for school, and what informed these concerns. To answer these questions, we conducted 18 semi-structured interviews with parents in the New York City area with children in grades K-8 in order to understand how they and their children's teachers use these technologies and what security concerns parents had, if any, about them. After learning about the Illuminate data breach from the second participant, we added a generic question about data breach awareness to the interviews for subsequent participants. In structuring the interview, we also took care to ask about general concerns before mentioning privacy concerns specifically, in part to minimize priming effects. Similarly, we left open the definition of a privacy concern in order to gain insight into participants' own perceptions of privacy. Interestingly, while many participants did not mention privacy as a concern, when asked directly, their responses to other questions did map to several well-known privacy issues. Because trust can mediate perceptions of privacy and security concerns, we also asked participants about their level of trust in their children's school and the DOE, and what factors contributed to that trust. So, some background on the participants and what they used. Most participants' children used a school-issued iPad, which had built-in internet access for those who lacked good internet access at home. This stood in contrast to the paper packets, which participants found very inconvenient to pick up and return in person. The most common apps used were Zoom or Google Meet, as well as iReady and RazKids, which are both learning platforms configured for children by the school. Although introduced during the pandemic, when we did interview participants in the summer of 2022, all but one reported their children's school was still using these platforms. Although some participants had reported asking about the possibility of not using some of these apps, none of our participants chose to follow through with opting out. In terms of the concerns parents had regarding technology usage, the top concerns reported were too much screen time, their children accessing or being shown inappropriate content, cyberbullying, stranger danger, and losing control over their data. This loss of control could be from unauthorized access or hacking, inappropriate handling or unwanted disclosure of the children's information, such as platforms collecting and sharing data, or educators leaving documents lying around, or gossiping. This is especially true of parents with children with IEPs, because these plans include detailed and sensitive information up to and including medical records, leading at least one participant feeling that their families with IEPs were at a privacy disadvantage, especially compared to those without IEPs. But what about the other concerns? Participants' concerns were informed by having heard of or experienced security incidents such as Zoom bombings, online vandalism, students sending each other inappropriate content. Interestingly, despite a requirement that families be notified, only 2 participants reported having heard about the Illuminate data breach in our interviews. Put a pin in that. The other thing that informed participants' concerns was security knowledge or lack thereof, or preferences around security. Participants felt that while schools provided them and their children devices and platforms, neither they nor their children, nor their children's educators were given guidance on how to use them, even when it was clear that they would continue to use these technologies. Because there was a lack of training for everyone all around, they were worried that schools and educators might not know nor utilize security best practices. Similarly, they did not like that the DOE was reactive rather than proactive, that is, reacting to incidents rather than anticipating and preventing them. Moreover, because of the rush to move to distance learning due to the pandemic, participants mentioned that they didn't have time to investigate the platforms their children would use for school, and thus worried about what they might have agreed to that they otherwise wouldn't have. Of course, some participants did not have any privacy concerns at all, and this was due to a few factors such as believing data collected and stored was uninteresting and not very sensitive or not identifiable, or the expectation that schools monitor their children's activities. Though one parent did express some concern over surveillance, mentioning how parents' attendance records and amount of times their family moved is used by CPS. And there's also the perceived safety of the platforms used. One participant thought that any data that's collected in a virtual classroom would stay in the virtual classroom. This is in part due to the fact that the DOE has approved the usage of these platforms and that they trusted their school and the DOE to keep their children safe. In fact, one parent believed that some of the platforms used were made by the DOE themselves. The largest contributing factors to this trust was communication and transparency about problems, followed by lack of incidents, and the factor that would 100% decrease their trust in the school institution was if a data breach were to occur. So, what are the implications of this? Well, firstly, our findings indicate that while parents were not given guidance on the technology their children would use, the onus was still on them to manage their children's account, creating an excess burden of having to make decisions and acquiesce to their children using systems that they do not understand. Earlier, I mentioned that some participants, given serious objections, they could potentially opt out of using certain things. But if they aren't given information about these things and the risks of using these things might entail, how they know that there was something to object to? And parents also delegated trust to the schools to keep their children safe. This trust is nothing new and is akin to trusting your doctor to advise on medical decisions or any other professional to do what they know. But is the trust parents place on children's schools warranted? Most of our participants cited the fact that their school was communicative and transparent about any incidents that occurred as a major factor in them trusting their school. An interesting side effect is that because parents are used to having problems communicated to them, when an incident is not communicated, this may lead parents to believe that there is no problem, which results in continued trust, until they find out about it, of course, which, or if they found out they were lying, which participants indicated that lying and lack of transparency was a fast way for them to lose trust. So let's circle back to the fact that only 2 participants had even known about the Illuminate data breach that affected over 800,000 students in New York City. In fact, one participant had only found out about the breach because they were looking through papers they were planning on throwing out. And this isn't unique to this participant. In fact, one news article mentioned that many parents in the New Rochelle, New York region saw the letter and assumed that it was a scam and threw it out. And this indicates that communications regarding this breach was ineffective. The other question to ask when asking whether trust is warranted is whether the DOE actually makes sure that the platforms they use are safe. On the DOE website, the DOE mentions that outside vendors do have to pass an audit to be used by the DOE. However, the criteria is mostly that the application meets FERPA requirements. Legal scholars have noted that FERPA is rife with loopholes that allow third-party companies a lot of leeway with regards to usage of student data, but we won't get into that here. The thing is, passing an audit does not mean that an application is safe. In fact, various applications used in classrooms have been found to have security flaws that expose users' data, mostly to do with not having proper encryption. In the case of the Illuminate data breach, the DOE states that this company inaccurately described the company's data security measures and that they had assured officials that all student data was encrypted when it was not. And this seems to indicate that the DOE doesn't verify claims as well as lends credence to participants' belief that an administration is reactive and not proactive. So the question now is, how can schools and school officials earn the trust parents put in them? Our participants thought that minimal information was being shared to third-party companies, but in light of the Illuminate data breach, it's clear that a lot of information, some sensitive, is being shared with these vendors. As such, parents should be informed of not only how to use it, but also what information would be shared to these companies. As such, one first step is obtaining informed consent from parents before adopting any new technology and providing reasonable alternatives should a parent object. While this was not possible at the beginning of the pandemic, now that there's no urgency to move to remote, this should be doable. The second thing would be figuring out how to better communicate incidents like data breaches so that people actually read the notices and understand not just what's going on, but what recourse they have. Given that there are existing channels where schools can reach parents when they need to, like field trips, consent for photography, or the child does something wrong, using these channels could be a potential avenue to obtain both obtain consent as well as notify parents about incidents. Similarly, we should figure out how we in the security community can help schools make sure vendors are not misrepresenting their claims. Lastly, I also encourage any parents in the audience to advocate for informed consent, adding digital literacy into the curriculum, as well as work with their children's schools to promote a more secure and privacy-preserving learning environment. Thank you.